It begins in a way that feels almost too small to matter. A word disappears, not from memory, not from language, but from use. You wake up like any other morning, reach for your phone, scroll through your messages, and something feels slightly off. You cannot explain it immediately because everything looks normal. The same conversations, the same people, the same привычный поток общения. But then you notice it. There are no names, not yours, not anyone else's. You open a chat. The messages are there. The tone is familiar. You know exactly who you are speaking to. But the name that should be at the top of the screen is gone. You frown, assuming it is a glitch, a small error in the system that will fix itself in a moment. You close the app, reopen it, check again. Still nothing. You go to your contacts. Empty. Not deleted, just unnamed. You still recognize the people. You remember them. You know everything about them. But there is no word that defines who they are. No label.
No identifier.
And that is when something deeper begins to feel wrong. Because names were not just words. They were anchors. Across the world, the same realization unfolds. People begin to notice that names have disappeared from every system. Documents, databases, identification records, everything that once relied on names now exists without them. The spaces where names should be are blank, as if they were never there. At first, people assume it is technical, a global failure, some kind of error in data systems. But then, something more unsettling becomes clear. It is not just digital. People try to say names, and they can't. The moment they attempt it, the word does not form. It stops, disappears, as if it no longer exists in language. You try to say your own name. The word feels close. You know it. You remember it. But when you try to speak it, nothing comes out. Just silence. And that silence confirms it. Names are gone. Completely. Within hours, confusion spreads. Not panic. Not yet. Because people still recognize each other. Faces are still familiar. Voices are still distinct. Memories are still intact. You know who your family is. You know who your friends are. You know who you are. But you cannot name it. And that creates a strange gap. A disconnect between identity and language. At first, people try to adapt quickly. They use descriptions instead. You, the one who lives with me, the person from work. It works, barely, but it feels unnatural, slow, imprecise, because names were efficient. They allowed instant recognition, instant reference. Without them, communication becomes heavier, longer, less direct. At the same time, something deeper begins to shift. Identity starts to feel less fixed, not because people forget who they are, but because the word that defined them is gone. And without that word, identity becomes something internal, something that cannot be easily expressed or confirmed. You cannot introduce yourself anymore. You cannot say, "This is me." You can only exist and let others understand. Or not. Within a day, systems begin to fail. Identification becomes complicated. Passports, licenses, records all lose a key component that once defined individuals. Governments try to replace names with numbers, codes, identifiers, but those feel cold, impersonal, and difficult to use in daily life. People resist them because a number is not a name, and something important is missing. At the same time, relationships begin to change in subtle ways. Calling someone becomes different. You no longer say their name to get their attention. You look at them, you gesture, you wait. Conversations lose a certain rhythm, a certain intimacy that names once carried. Saying someone's name was not just functional. It was emotional. It created connection, recognition, importance. Without it, interactions feel slightly distant, more neutral, more abstract. Even in close relationships, something feels different. Parent looks at their child. A partner looks at the person they love. They know exactly who they are, but they cannot call them by the word that once held all that meaning. And that absence creates a subtle emptiness, not obvious, but constant. At the same time, something unexpected begins to happen. Labels disappear, not just names, but everything tied to them. Titles lose meaning. Reputation becomes harder to track. Fame begins to fade, because recognition was tied to naming. Without names, identity becomes less visible on a larger scale. You can still know someone personally, but beyond that, they become harder to define, harder to remember, harder to distinguish. The world begins to feel more equal, not because people are the same, but because the markers that once separated them are gone. At the same time, memory begins to shift. You remember people differently, not by their names, but by their presence, their actions, their voice, their behavior. And over time, that changes how people think about each other. Less as labels, more as experiences. But this change is not entirely positive, because names also created responsibility. If someone did something, you could identify them, call them out, hold them accountable. Now that becomes harder, not impossible, but less immediate, because identity is no longer fixed in a word. It is fluid, contextual, dependent on recognition rather than naming, and that creates uncertainty. At the same time, something deeper begins to emerge. A question: who are you without your name? At first, it seems simple. You are still you. Nothing has changed. But as time passes, that answer becomes less clear. Because names were more than identifiers. They were stories, history, meaning. They carried expectations, associations, emotions built over time. Without them, those layers begin to fade. Not disappear, but weaken. And identity becomes something that must be constantly reinforced through action rather than defined by a single word. You cannot rely on your name to represent you. You must show who you are, again, and again, and again. As the first day comes to an end, as the world begins to adjust to a reality where no one can be named, one realization becomes impossible to ignore. Names were never just for others. They were for you. A way to hold yourself together. A way to define where you begin and where you end. And without that, identity does not disappear, but it becomes something less stable, less certain, less easy to understand. Because when no one has a name, you are no longer something that can be said. You are something that must be recognized. And recognition is not always guaranteed. It does not take long for people to realize that losing names does not erase identity. Complicates it. At first, recognition still works. You see someone you know, and your mind immediately connects them to memory. Their face, their voice, their movement, all combine into something familiar, something you understand without needing a word. But as days pass, that familiarity begins to weaken in subtle ways. Not because people change, but because the brain no longer has a simple anchor to attach them to. Names were shortcuts, efficient, immediate. Without them, recognition becomes slower, more dependent on context. You hesitate for a fraction of a second before understanding who you are looking at. That hesitation grows over time, especially in environments where many people look similar, act similarly, exist within the same patterns. Crowds become confusing, not chaotic, but uncertain. You recognize people, but not instantly. And that delay begins to change how interactions feel. At the same time, memory continues to shift. You begin to remember people not as fixed identities, but as collections of experiences. Someone is no longer a name tied to a person. They are a set of moments, conversations, impressions that come together when you see them. And that makes memory more complex, more detailed, but also less stable. Because without a single label to unify those experiences, they can drift apart. You may remember what someone did, what they said, how they made you feel, But connecting all of that into one clear identity becomes harder. People begin to feel fragmented in each other's minds, not fully lost, but less defined. At the same time, society begins to reorganize around new systems of identification. Numbers become common, codes, digital markers. People are assigned identifiers that can be used in official contexts, in systems that require precision and clarity. And those systems work efficiently, but they feel distant, cold, because a number does not carry meaning. It does not create connection. It does not hold memory the way a name once did. So while systems function, human interaction continues to struggle. People avoid using numbers in personal life. They rely on descriptions instead. The one who helped me yesterday, the person who lives next to me, the one I trust. These descriptions become new forms of identity, not fixed, but evolving. And that evolution changes how people relate to each other. At the same time, something unexpected begins to happen. Judgment shifts. Without names, many assumptions disappear. Names once carried cultural, social, and personal associations. They suggested background, origin, expectations. Without them, people are forced to engage more directly without those initial filters. And in some ways, that creates fairness. People are seen more for what they do than what they are called. But it also creates uncertainty, because names provided context. Without that context, people feel less predictable, less easy to place within a mental framework. And that uncertainty changes trust, not reducing it, but delaying it. At the same time, relationships continue to evolve. Close connections adapt more easily, because recognition is based on deeper factors: voice, behavior, presence. People who spend time together learn to identify each other without hesitation. Their connection becomes less dependent on labels and more dependent on experience. And in that way, relationships can become stronger, more real, because they are built on what is actually shared, not on what is symbolized. But for weaker connections, things fade. Acquaintances become harder to maintain. Casual relationships disappear, because without names, it is harder to hold onto someone who is not already deeply connected to your life. And slowly, social circles become smaller, more defined, more intentional. At the same time, something deeper begins to shift inside individuals. Self-perception changes. Without a name, you cannot refer to yourself in the same way. You cannot say, "This is who I am," using a single word that carries your identity. Instead, you begin to think of yourself in terms of actions, patterns, and experiences. I am the one who does this. I am the one who chooses this. Identity becomes something you describe, not something you declare. And that changes how people understand themselves. Less fixed, more fluid, because without a name, there is nothing to hold identity in a single place. It must be continuously created. At the same time, something else begins to emerge. Freedom, not in an obvious way, but in a subtle one. Without a name, there is less attachment to past identity. People begin to feel less bound by who they were, less defined by expectations that came with their name. They can change more easily, shift direction, redefine themselves without the weight of a label that others recognize. But that freedom comes with a cost. Because without a stable identity, there is also less certainty, less grounding. People begin to question themselves more, not because they are lost, but because they are no longer fixed. And that creates a different kind of instability, not external, internal. At the same time, large-scale systems continue to adapt. Education changes, workplaces evolve, communication becomes more visual, more contextual, more dependent on presence than on reference. The world continues to function, but it functions differently, less labeled, more immediate, more dependent on what is happening now rather than what has been defined before. And in that shift, something important becomes clear. Names were not just tools for communication. They were structures. They held identity in place. They allowed people to be recognized instantly, remembered easily, understood quickly. Without them, everything slows down, not physically, but conceptually, because understanding someone now requires more effort, more attention, more presence. And as time passes, as humanity fully adapts to this new way of existing, a final realization begins to settle. A name was never who you were. It was only the beginning of understanding. But without that beginning, everything that follows becomes more difficult, more complex, more real, because now identity is no longer given. It is experienced. And in a world without names, the only way to truly know someone is to pay attention, and that is something people were never forced to do before.